Welcome back. So today, with the official election of Italy's first far-right government, I don't like throwing around the F word. I don't like throwing around fascism because fascism is like impossible to define. It's like trying to nail jello to a wall. Definitely far-right though. With Italy's first far-right government since Mussolini himself, I figured today we would take a look back and we would look at Mussolini and fascist Italy done in a very quick bite-sized format from our friend at History Matters in a 10-minute history video. Italy is a fascinating nation. It has been a place of not a lot of stability, to say the least, right? It's a place where governments definitely come and go, and with the election of now a far-right government, we'll see how far it goes. But let's take a look back and see when Italy was officially a fascist nation, the first fascist nation in all of Europe. Later to fall would be Germany. And yeah, let's take a look at this. And hey, maybe we can point out some similarities today. Let's keep going. If you haven't already yet, please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let's get into it.
1915, and Italy has just joined the First World War. It sided with the Entente powers despite previously having made a defensive pact with the Central powers. Because it was Austria-Hungary that invaded Serbia in 1914, that meant that it wasn't a defensive war and thus Italy could sit it out. Both sides had tried to convince Italy to join them, and it was the Entente who won out in the end when Italy signed the Treaty of London, which promised them all of this territory from Austria-Hungary as well as a mountain of cash.
Spoilers,
on May the 23rd, Italy declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy was all in. Italy didn't exactly perform very well during the war, but fortunately their main opponent was Austria-Hungary, who also didn't perform very well. In late 19...
And even that too. So I know the Italian army sort of gets dogged on a lot, especially from a historical sense, but I'll get more into World War II later because that's another history video I'll be doing from the Armchair Historian. But you got to remember, Italy lost a lot of men in this war. I mean, in comparison to France or Germany, yes, not as much, or certainly Russia, but I mean, I think that Italy lost almost 500,000 men, right? Some of their youngest and brightest, if you will, to this war, and they really, really wanted that territory back. And this was sort of thought as being the culmination of Italy, which at this point in time is a relatively young nation. Okay, not as young as something like Canada, for example, but still relatively new nation, really looking to culminate itself into a mature, being one of the great Western powers.
1917 came Italy's greatest defeat during the war, the Battle of Caporetto. This saw the Central Powers push this far into Italy, thus threatening Venice and also seeing 300,000 Italian casualties.
Yeah.
In order to raise morale, the Liberal government promised soldiers loads of things like the vote and free land. Anyway, Austro-Hungarian successes in the war, just like in everything else, didn't last. In November 1918, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto began, which saw the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army and the end of the war on the Italian front. A week after this victory, the First World War was over and Italy was free to celebrate and gain the lands the Allies had promised them, or at least they'd hoped. During the Paris Peace Conference, the Italians demanded what they had been promised plus a little bit more. The Allies said no and instead gave these areas to Italy and the rest of the promised territories to the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Many Italians felt that this was a gross betrayal by the rest of the Entente, and this became known as the Vittoria Mutilata, the mutilated victory. The displeasure at the post-war settlement came to a head when Gabriele D'Annunzio led a group of armed Italian nationalists to the city of Fiume and occupied it. They wanted Italy to annex it, but the government refused. As such, it was declared to be a free state, but after the Italian navy blockaded the city, D'Annunzio surrendered. To make matters worse, the post-war economy was in ruins, and since all of the soldiers had been demobilised and many of the wartime factories were closed, unemployment skyrocketed. Also, the promise of land to the soldiers wasn't honoured, but they did get the vote. All of this disappointment surrounding the outcome of the war, combined with the economic downturn, meant that people became much more extreme in their demands. This led...
And nor was this really unique to Italy in and of itself, right? We saw this happening in Germany. We saw this happening in other places in Eastern Europe, for example, Romania. We saw this happen in Bulgaria as well, and Poland too, right? Where just whole economies, whole classes of people were really collapsing at this time. And I know that the Roaring 20s are, well, they're called that, the Roaring 20s, but there were a lot of people in Europe that did not feel that effect at all, especially those that were living rurally or people that were already not well off anyways. As well as in the cities, they were getting clogged up with more and more people for unemployment, and really not a nice time in history. And with the utter collapse of many countries' economies, you know, especially those in the East faring off worse than those in the West, arguably Italy was one of those that was hit hardest of the Western nations, arguably.
To what's known as the Red Biennium, which saw 2 years of increased support for socialist parties, greater industrial action, some of which was quite violent, and even calls for revolution like that in Russia. These more radical socialists were quite frightening to many Italians, and to prevent them from gaining power, some turned to a new group, the fascists, led by a certain Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had previously himself been a socialist, but he was kicked out of the party when he supported Italian entry into World War I. After the war, many unemployed veterans joined the Black Shirts, a fascist militia who went up and down the country making life pretty miserable for any and all socialists they could find. Mussolini wasn't in complete control of the Black Shirts though. Regional leaders like Italo Balbo held immense sway but did largely accept Mussolini's leadership. The current Prime Minister of Italy at this point was a man called Giovanni Giolitti, who was a conservative and disliked the growing power of the socialists but also was concerned about the fascists. He decided to call a new election to Italy's parliament, the House of Deputies, where he would form a broad coalition which would include Mussolini and his fascists. The idea was that giving Mussolini a legitimate position in government would make him act in a more respectable manner and kill off the fascist movement. The idea was a bad one. Giolitti actually lost seats during this election and the socialists gained them, sort of. Some of the seats were gained by the newly formed Communist Party, created by a certain Antonio Gramsci. As a result, passing legislation was much more difficult and the fascists now had friends in high places. In late 1921, the fascists decided to become a formal political party, the National Fascist Party, the PNF. Mussolini wanted to enter government via peaceful means, but the party's members wanted him to take power now. On October the 28th, 1922, the fascists conducted their infamous March on Rome, whereby tens of thousands of black shirts marched on Rome. Mussolini wasn't there himself though, he was in Milan ready to flee to Switzerland if it all went wrong. Victor Emmanuel III was asked to sign an order allowing the army to open fire on the black shirts. The king, for reasons unknown, did not, and the next day he made Mussolini the prime minister.
Yeah, and that's the key thing too, is that I think when a lot of people think of the March on Rome, if they even know what it is, you think it's like hundreds of thousands and they took over the government in a violent coup. They really didn't. They just sort of walked in and demanded that he be made prime minister, and it happened, right? And unlike in Germany or in other nations at the time that were sort of falling to authoritarianism, Italy did have the structure in place for the fascist party to not have complete and 100% utter control, unlike somewhere in Germany or in Russia. Well, Germany later, but certainly Russia at this time, post the Civil War. And there were, sort of mechanisms in place to keep some freedoms allowed within Italy that just did not exist in Russia at the time. For example, the monarchy was still put in place, right? King Victor Emmanuel III was still king. And this would later come into the war when Mussolini gets booted out of power.
So the proportional representation system used in Italian elections meant that no party ever won a majority. Mussolini, along with many others, sought to change this, and a man called Giacomo Acerbo put forward a law known as the Acerbo Law, which meant that the winning party in any future elections would get a clear majority of seats.
Yep.
This law was supported by most parties for two reasons. The first was that everyone hated the current electoral system since it made weak governments. The second, and arguably main reason they supported the law, was the armed black shirts who were in the room with them. Another election was held in 1924, with Mussolini and the Fascist Party standing for the first time at the head of a right-wing coalition. They won about 65% of the vote, and there's a lot of debate as to how clean the elections were. There was certainly violence against Mussolini's opponents, but he was also very popular, and many Italians were hoping he would fix the country's problems. The head of the socialist opposition, Giacomo Matteotti, spoke out against Mussolini's victory, saying it was tainted by the violence inflicted by his followers. Shortly after this, Matteotti was kidnapped and murdered by fascist black shirts.
Yep.
The murder of Matteotti forced many of Mussolini's coalition partners to abandon him, and it looked like his grip on power was slipping. The fascist membership wanted Mussolini to be more extreme and hostile to his coalition partners, whereas Mussolini didn't want to lose more support in the Chamber of Deputies, which was becoming more and more difficult since he was directly implicated in Matteotti's murder. As such, he took a major risk. On January the 3rd, 1925, Mussolini walked into the Chamber of Deputies and dared anyone to remove him. Nobody did. This is seen as the end of liberal Italy and the beginnings of fascist Italy, but the difference wasn't immediate, and in many ways there was little difference at all. Conservatives and liberals were still being appointed to positions of authority. That said, Mussolini did become a dictator. In late 1925 he went from being the Prime Minister of Italy to being the head of the government, although he's better known by his other title, Il Duce, the leader. The next year, after a few assassination attempts, he banned all opposition parties, had Gramsci arrested, and enacted strict press censorship.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that during this time, the fascists, unlike in other places like in Germany, which would come later, is that or in Russia at this point, is that the fascists, the party holders, the party leaders, sorry, did not have control over the regional districts, as with the case with Nazi Germany, right? These were still people that were left, who were there before the fascists, and they didn't have that, what would you say, crazy amount of drive towards their ideology, right? They weren't complete ideologues. And that was really one big difference in Italian society and in fascism in Italy than between the, complete totalitarianism that was happening in the Soviet Union or in Germany as well. Another thing too is that Mussolini at this time was really quite popular. And I think it's Pius the Ninth, I think was the Pope at the time. I might be wrong on that. Said that he was enlightened and, a gift from God and all that, which, yeah. Some things age like milk, don't they?
The new regime began a fierce propaganda campaign and sought to present Mussolini as an unassailable leader in the same vein as the old Roman emperors. Mussolini's first goal was to fix Italy's ailing economy. He sought to increase the levels of industrialisation across Italy, which were far behind the other great powers. Mussolini also sought to win several economic battles to secure Italy's position as a leading nation, the two most important being the battle for grain and the battle for the lira. The battle for grain was designed to make Italy self-sufficient in grain production. The battle for the lira was meant to make the lira more valuable as an international currency, which would make importing certain resources on which Italy lacked more feasible. Mussolini also made an agreement with Pope Pius XI to settle the Roman question. The Pope didn't recognise Italian sovereignty over him, and Mussolini cut him a deal. We'll give you some money, you'll stop openly criticising fascism, and the Vatican will gain its independence. They agreed, and in 1929 the Vatican City became the world's smallest independent country. Furthermore, Mussolini's government encouraged people to take up sports and also urged women to have more children. All of the aforementioned changes largely didn't work and made life worse for many Italians, but it was seen as their duty to endure for the sake of Italy. Their endurance would ideally see Italy recapture its old glory from the days of the Roman Empire. Mussolini had promised the Italian people that he would rebuild the Roman Empire for them, which is why he had ambitions on all of these countries. To the north lay Austria, who everyone knew that Germany under a certain Adolf Hitler wanted to annex. In 1935, Mussolini...
Yeah, and one key thing is that Italian quality of life was actually lower. Right, it was actually lower after Mussolini's takeover than before. Right, he made a lot of industry. He what is it called? When the state overtakes industry, right? He created a lot of new departments and other things like this, and really made more authoritarian control. Whereas it was promised, we would continue the free market and all this stuff, and it was generally just poor economic planning and poor economic policy that made the lives of Italians actually worse, right? After the takeover of power than before. But as well as that, is that one thing that he did inherit, though, which is unlike something that the Russians did not inherit, is that he had a fully functioning civil servant state, right? And these civil servants, as well as talking about the ideology I was saying before, they were not ardent fascists that were serving the government, but rather just everyday, day-to-day civil servants that obviously did not have the same aims as ideologues that were in power as they did in Germany, for example. So just a few ways on how it's different.
He signed a treaty with France and Britain known as the Stresa Front, which guaranteed Austrian independence. You see, Mussolini didn't really like the Nazi regime in Germany, and the whole German master race thing made him uncomfortable because he, wasn't a German. The Stresa Front fell apart when Italy invaded Abyssinia, nowadays called Ethiopia, which was conquered by 1937. Mussolini also sent volunteers to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and in this conflict and the previous, Hitler had given Italy-Germany support, and relations between the two countries improved. Mussolini now felt that Britain and France's time had come and gone, and that Europe would now revolve around the Rome-Berlin axis, hence
and a lot of
the
this
Axis powers get their name.
And a lot of this too was that the war in Ethiopia, I mean, there was almost no consequences to Italy. For example, Britain and France actually embargoed Italy, but they didn't embargo them on things like coal or oil or wheat or steel or anything like this. They embargoed them on things like foie de gras, right, and perfumes. Right? So nothing that actually mattered for making an economy, but rather sort of frivolous things. And this sort of weak display of action that the League of Nations had which was so centered around Britain and France, was really, really bad for its international image, and really just, it was on its way out already, but this was one of the major things. The Abyssinian, or now we know Ethiopian War, was one of the things that just tanked the credibility of the League of Nations.
Italy and Germany continued their united front over the coming years. In 1938, Italy sided with Germany over the annexation of Austria and its later dismemberment of Czechoslovakia,
which Hitler had to ask for Mussolini's permission personally for the annexation of Austria.
Germany sided with Italy in 1939 when it sent an ultimatum to King Zog of Albania to accept Italian overlordship. He refused, but there was nothing that Albania could do, and so, annexation.
Yeah, and this is because Albania was growing closer and closer to Italy, and that so much of their trade imports and exports were from Italy, and they were basically an Italian puppet state at this point anyways.
In May of 1939, Italy and Germany signed the Pact of Steel, an alliance in which both countries promised to help the other out in the event of war. On September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and suddenly, World War II. Mussolini wouldn't bring Italy into the war until mid-1940, after the fall of Paris. In the October of 1940, Mussolini came up with a brilliant idea. Let's invade Greece. This was, to put it mildly, a complete disaster, and Italian troops were trounced by the Greeks, which forced the Germans to come down and bail them out.
And not only that, so they actually, the Greeks actually pushed, sorry, let me just get to the map here.
Let's invade Greece.
Yes, so the Italians actually pushed into Albania, and it looked like they might have even won here, right? And so the Germans told Italy specifically, do not invade Greece, because they didn't want to sort of awaken Britain in this area and create another front. But Mussolini, feeling that he needed a victory for the will of the people, or whatever you will, for his own image, did it anyways, which ultimately delayed Barbarossa. And then we can get into the infinite amount of what if, alternate history of saying, well, what if Barbarossa wasn't delayed by 4 weeks, and this and that, and the weather and supply, and then you can have your own armchair debate as you will. Already done videos on why Germany could never have won World War II, but I digress. So the invasion of Greece, complete disaster. The Germans also had to send a lot of paratroopers and elite units to Crete, where they were absolutely decimated. One of the first paratrooping operations in history. And just wasn't worth it in the end.
This was, to put it mildly, a complete disaster, and Italian troops were trounced by the Greeks, which forced the Germans to come down and bail them out. And over the next couple of years, things got much worse. The tide of the war turned against the Axis powers. Italy lost its colonies in East Africa, lost many troops aiding with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and after the Battle of El Alamein, lost its Libyan colony in mid-1943. Sicily, then Italy proper, was invaded shortly after this, and in September...
And this was because Winston Churchill saw Italy as the soft underbelly to Europe, and so this was the better way of invading the European mainland rather than going through France, which they eventually would in June of 1944.
In 1943, Mussolini was deposed and arrested. Germany then occupied the north of Italy and set up a puppet state, the Italian Social Republic, which was led by Mussolini because he managed to escape. The rest of it...
Actually, he was aided by the Germans, who did a specific mission to break him out.
Italy, under Victor Emmanuel III, joined the Allies and declared war on Germany. The Italian Social Republic was plagued by issues of partisans, Italians who resisted Mussolini's rule, and they did a great deal of damage to its war effort. By April 1945, the front lines looked like this, and on the 25th of that month, the Republic collapsed. 2 days later, Mussolini was captured by partisans and shot the next day. The war, and fascist Italy, was over.
And not only was he shot the next day, his body was hung up at a gas station in public display, and if you want, you can look up the photos on the internet. Definitely not safe for work.
In the aftermath of fascist Italy, not much changed. The same liberals and conservatives who had been given power by Mussolini retained it after the war. Of course, Italy did see a return to democracy, and in 1946 it held a referendum on the monarchy's existence. Victor Emmanuel had abdicated on behalf of his son, Umberto II, to make the monarchy more appealing, but the Italian people voted to abolish the monarchy in 1946. And thus, the Republic of Italy was born. I hope you enjoyed this.
Yeah, so great video. Fascist Italy is a very fascinating topic because it's the birthplace of fascism. However, the difference in fascism between Italy and Germany is just, to me is really, really interesting. And how the state wasn't as, so to say, it was definitely authoritarian, but arguably not totalitarian. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed that one. spicy news coming out today, and we'll see what happens in Europe. Looks like with Sweden going right and Italy going right, who knows? We'll see what the future holds. Thank you all very much for joining me, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.